Welcome back to Tell Me More Stories Told Us podcast. You know, where we dig up the most captivating stories from history. And today, well, we're going back in time to the 14th century.
Okay.
To a world gripped by fear and death. A time when a pandemic swept across continents and left a trail of devastation.
Yeah.
Unlike any seen before.
We're talking about...
Can we talk about the Black Death?
The Black Death, yeah. It's hard to overstate the impact of the Black Death.
I can imagine.
I mean, imagine a world where, entire villages are just wiped out.
Right.
Cities just reek of death, and fear is just a constant companion. I mean, this
Yeah.
wasn't just a fleeting epidemic.
Right.
This reshaped the course of history.
Okay, so before we get into like all the details, set the scene for us. Like, what was life like before this pandemic hit?
Okay.
Help us understand just what changed so drastically.
So picture Europe in the early 1300s.
Okay.
It's a vibrant place. Bustling trade routes connect east and west.
Yeah.
Cities are flourishing. The population is booming.
Sounds pretty good.
It was.
Yeah.
But all that changes in the blink of an eye.
And that is where our story begins.
Yeah.
We're talking about the Black Death.
Yeah.
A pandemic so devastating that it wiped out a third to half of Europe's population.
That's right. We're talking about 75 to 200 million people
Wow.
across Eurasia.
Yeah.
And to put that into perspective,
Yeah.
it took centuries for the population to recover to pre-plague levels.
Centuries.
Centuries.
That's just mind-boggling.
Yeah.
So, when we think of plagues, we often think of, rats and fleas.
Uh-huh.
Is that accurate in this case?
Absolutely. The culprit behind the Black Death was the bacterium Yersinia pestis.
Okay.
And it was transmitted through fleas that lived on rodents, especially black rats.
Okay.
These rats thrived in urban areas.
Yeah.
And with trade routes connecting, various parts of the world, it created the perfect storm for the disease to spread rapidly.
So it's like a chain reaction, rats, fleas, and then humans.
Exactly.
But where did this nightmare begin? Was there like a patient zero?
Yeah.
Or a ground zero, so to speak?
That's a question that has puzzled historians for centuries.
I bet.
While the precise origins are still debated,
Okay.
evidence suggests that it might have originated in Central Asia, perhaps China or even the Middle East.
So this wasn't just a European phenomenon.
Right.
It had already wreaked havoc elsewhere before reaching Europe's shores.
Exactly.
Wow.
And one of the most dramatic and perhaps gruesome episodes in the Black Death's journey to Europe involves the siege of Kaffa,
Okay.
a Genoese trading post in Crimea in 1346.
This sounds like the start of a truly horrifying story.
It is.
Tell me more.
So the city was under siege by Mongol armies,
Okay.
and the Mongols themselves were suffering from the plague.
Oh, no.
Now imagine this, in an act of what we might call early biological warfare, they catapulted plague-infected corpses
Oh, my God.
over the city walls.
That's just horrific. But did it work?
We can't be sure about its military effectiveness. But what we do know is that Genoese traders fleeing the besieged city carried the plague with them westward.
So these fleeing ships became, in essence, carriers of death, spreading the plague across the Mediterranean.
Exactly. They landed in Constantinople, and from there, the plague quickly spread throughout Europe.
So if we're talking about a timeline,
Yeah.
when did the Black Death actually hit mainland Europe?
By 1347, it had reached Sicily and southern Italy,
Wow.
and within a year, it had ravaged France, Spain, Portugal, and England.
Gosh.
By 1349, it was in Germany and Scandinavia, and by 1351, it reached Russia.
It's just relentless.
It was relentless.
It's hard to imagine the terror that people must have felt.
Yeah.
Just picture entire cities shutting down, mass graves being dug, and no one knowing how to stop this invisible enemy.
And remember, this wasn't just happening in Europe.
Right.
The Black Death was a global pandemic.
Yeah.
It spread through North Africa and the Middle East,
Wow.
reaching Egypt, Mecca, and even India.
It's hard to grasp the sheer scale of it all.
It is.
Before we go any further, I want to remind everyone listening to hit that subscribe button.
Yes.
You don't want to miss the rest of this deep dive into the Black Death,
Definitely.
one of history's most defining events.
Now let's talk about the disease itself.
Okay.
It wasn't just one type of plague, right?
Right, I've heard of bubonic plague, but there were others too, weren't there?
Yes, there were three main forms.
Okay.
Bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic.
Yep.
Bubonic plague, named after the painfully swollen lymph nodes or buboes, was the most common.
Okay.
It came with fever, chills, vomiting of blood,
Oh,
and often death within a matter of days.
that's gruesome. And the other forms?
Pneumonic plague attacked the lungs,
Okay.
causing coughing, chest pain, and difficulty breathing.
Yeah.
It was even more deadly than the bubonic form,
Really?
with a mortality rate approaching 95%.
95%?
Yeah.
That's just terrifying. And what about septicemic plague?
That one infected the bloodstream, leading to high fever, blackening of the skin due to internal bleeding,
Oh, gosh.
and almost certain death.
That's awful.
Imagine the sheer terror of seeing those symptoms appear on your loved ones,
I can't imagine.
knowing there was little you could do.
It's chilling to even think about.
It is.
And to make matters worse, people back then had no idea what caused this disease.
Right.
Or how to treat it.
Exactly. Imagine facing this terrifying plague with limited medical knowledge.
Right.
People believed it was caused by bad air-poisoned wells,
Wow.
or even divine punishment.
So what did they do? How did they try to protect themselves?
Desperate for answers, they turned to all sorts of remedies.
Yeah.
Some sensible, others downright bizarre.
Like what?
They carried pouches of fragrant herbs,
Ah.
burned incense,
Okay.
and even resorted to bloodletting.
Bloodletting.
Yeah.
Didn't that weaken them further?
It did, unfortunately. Most of their treatments were not only ineffective, but often harmful.
It's heartbreaking to think of people suffering and dying without any real hope of a cure.
It certainly is.
Yeah.
And the Black Death wasn't just a physical affliction. It had
No.
a profound psychological impact as well.
You mean the fear, the despair?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The constant threat of death, the breakdown of social order,
Yeah.
the sight of mass graves, all of it took a toll on people's mental and emotional well-being.
Yeah.
It's hard to fathom the trauma they endured.
So not only were they battling a deadly disease,
Right.
but they were also grappling with the psychological scars it left behind.
Precisely. And this trauma would have a lasting impact, shaping art, literature, and even religious beliefs for centuries to come.
Wow.
But that's a story for another part of our deep dive.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. The Black Death left an indelible mark
Yeah.
on the human psyche.
Yeah.
But amidst the devastation,
Hmm.
there were also those who sought to understand the disease,
Okay.
not through superstition, but through observation and reason.
That's interesting. So even in those dark times, there were glimmers of scientific curiosity.
Indeed, for instance, Giovanni Boccaccio, the Italian writer,
Okay.
he provided a vivid account of the plague in Florence in his famous work, The Decameron.
Oh, right.
He meticulously documented the symptoms, the social impact, the fear, the
Mhm.
despair.
Yeah, I remember reading the Decameron in college.
Right.
It's that collection of stories told by a group of young people who fled to the countryside to escape the plague in Florence.
Yes.
It's fascinating how literature can offer us a window into the past,
Yeah.
into the human experience of such a cataclysmic event.
Exactly. Boccaccio wasn't a scientist,
Right.
but his detailed observations provided valuable insights into the nature of the plague.
So he was like a chronicler of his time, a witness to history.
Precisely. And then there were physicians like Guy de Chauliac,
Okay.
a French surgeon who served Pope Clement VI during the Black Death.
Okay.
He advocated for practical measures like quarantining the sick
Okay.
and using protective clothing.
That's remarkable. He was promoting ideas that we still use today to control infectious diseases.
Yes.
Wow, he was ahead of his time.
He was, though he couldn't cure the plague. His efforts to understand its contagious nature and to contain its spread marked a significant step forward in the fight against disease.
It's inspiring to see that even in the face of such overwhelming adversity,
Yeah.
there were those who refused to give in to despair and instead sought knowledge and solutions.
Absolutely. And speaking of solutions,
Okay.
while there was no cure for the Black Death at the time,
Right.
it's fascinating to explore how the pandemic inadvertently contributed to the decline of feudalism in Europe.
Now that's an interesting twist.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have immediately connected the Black Death with the fall of feudalism. Tell me more.
Well, think about it.
Oh,
Feudalism relied on a large peasant population bound to the land working for lords.
right.
But the Black Death wiped out a significant portion of the workforce.
Right. So suddenly there were fewer peasants to till the land and produce goods.
Exactly. This labor shortage empowered the surviving peasants.
Okay.
They were in high demand, which meant they could demand higher wages
Yeah.
and better working conditions.
So the plague, in a way, shifted the balance of power in favor of the working class.
Precisely. It weakened the grip of the feudal lords
Okay.
and accelerated the transition to a more market-based economy.
Wow. It's a stark reminder that even the most devastating events
Yeah.
can have unintended consequences, sometimes leading to unexpected social and economic changes.
Indeed, and the Black Death's impact wasn't limited to Europe.
Right.
It disrupted trade routes,
Okay.
causing economic ripples across continents.
So even those parts of the world that weren't as severely affected by the plague still felt its impact.
Absolutely. It was a global event,
Yeah.
a turning point in human history.
It makes you wonder, how did people cope
Yeah.
with such widespread death and disruption?
Right?
What happened to their beliefs,
Mm,
their values, their art?
that's a great question. The Black Death had a profound impact on art, literature, and religious beliefs.
Okay.
It became a recurring theme in artistic expression,
Yeah.
reflecting the deep psychological scars it left on society.
So it wasn't just a physical event, it was a cultural and spiritual earthquake as well.
Exactly. Take, for instance, the Dance Macabre, or Dance of Death.
Okay.
This artistic motif, which became popular during and after the Black Death, depicted skeletons leading people from all walks of life in a procession to the grave.
Oh, I've seen those images.
Yeah.
They're quite haunting.
They served as a stark reminder of the universality of death,
Right?
a theme that resonated deeply in a world ravaged by plague.
Yeah, and this wasn't just a passing fad.
No.
The Black Death's influence on art and literature continued for centuries.
Absolutely. From the grim imagery of Peter Bruegel the Elder's The Triumph of Death, to the existential themes explored in Albert Camus' novel The Plague,
Yeah.
the Black Death's shadow looms large in human creative expression.
It's a testament to the enduring power of this historical event.
Yeah.
And speaking of enduring power, the Black Death wasn't a one-time event.
Right.
It kept coming back, didn't it?
Yes. Sadly, Europe experienced recurring outbreaks of plague for centuries after the initial wave.
Wow.
While none reached the devastating scale of the Black Death,
Right?
each outbreak brought fresh terror and suffering.
Imagine living with that constant threat, never knowing when the plague might return. It must have been terrifying.
It certainly was, and yet, amidst the recurring waves of plague,
Yeah.
people found ways to rebuild their lives, their communities, their hopes.
It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit.
It is, and it reminds us that even in the darkest of times,
Yeah.
humanity finds a way to persevere, to adapt,
Right.
and to find meaning in the face of adversity.
It's incredible to think about how people not only survived this, but rebuilt their lives after such a cataclysmic event.
It is.
It makes you wonder if there were any positive outcomes,
Hmm.
that emerged from the ashes of the Black Death.
It's a curious thing to consider, isn't it?
Yeah.
But yes, in the wake of such devastation, some changes did occur
Yeah.
that, from our modern perspective,
Yeah.
could be seen as beneficial.
Like what? I'm having trouble imagining anything good coming out of such a horrific experience.
Well, as we discussed earlier, the Black Death led to a significant labor shortage.
Right.
And this had a profound impact on the economic and social structure of Europe.
Okay.
With fewer workers available, their value increased dramatically.
Yeah.
Peasants and laborers found themselves in a position to demand better wages and working conditions.
So in a way, the Black Death inadvertently helped to dismantle the rigid feudal system that had been in place for centuries.
Precisely. It disrupted the traditional power dynamics, empowering the lower classes,
Wow.
and paving the way for new economic and social models to emerge.
That's a remarkable twist. It's almost as if the plague and its destructive wake sowed the seeds for a more equitable society.
It's a complex issue, of course,
Like-
and historians continue to debate the long-term consequences of the Black Death.
Yeah.
But there's no doubt that it had a profound and lasting impact on the course of history.
And it's not just the social and economic changes. The Black Death also had a lasting impact on our understanding of disease and public health, didn't it?
Absolutely. While people in the 14th century didn't understand the science behind the plague, their experiences laid the groundwork for some of the public health practices we still use today.
Like quarantining.
Exactly. The word quarantine itself comes from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days.
Oh, wow.
This refers to the period of isolation imposed on ships arriving in Venice during the Black Death to prevent the spread of the disease.
That's fascinating. So this practice, which has become so familiar to us in recent years, has its roots in the Black Death. It shows how, even in the darkest of times, people were searching for ways to protect themselves and their communities.
And those efforts, however rudimentary they may seem now, were crucial in shaping our understanding of how to contain infectious diseases.
As we've been discussing the Black Death, I can't help but think about the parallels to our own times. We've experienced our own pandemic with COVID-19, and while it wasn't as deadly as the Black Death, it's certainly given us a taste of what it's like to face a global health crisis.
It has indeed. The fear, the uncertainty, the disruption to our lives, the social and economic consequences.
Right.
These are all echoes of what people experienced during the Black Death.
It's almost as if history is whispering a warning, reminding us that pandemics are not just events of the past, but a recurring threat that we must be prepared for.
A very pertinent observation, but thankfully we're in a much better position to fight these threats today.
Right.
We have the benefit of scientific knowledge, medical advancements, and global communication networks that were unimaginable in the 14th century.
We have vaccines, antibiotics,
Yeah.
and a far greater understanding of how diseases spread and how to contain them.
Exactly. And yet the Black Death reminds us that we can't afford to be complacent.
Right. We need to invest in the public health infrastructure, support scientific research, and foster global cooperation.
Precisely, the lessons of the Black Death are as relevant today as they were centuries ago.
It's a powerful reminder, for
Yeah.
sure.
It's a story of tragedy and resilience, of loss and renewal.
Yeah.
It's a stark reminder of the fragility of human life and the interconnectedness of our world.
Well, this has been a truly fascinating deep dive into one of history's most impactful events.
Mhm.
Thanks for joining us on Tell Me More Stories Told Us podcast. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep telling those stories.